who might have taken MH370? Last week, we talked about how the Australian officials were certain from very early on in the process that the pilot had committed mass murder-suicide. The reason they thought this was because the Malaysians told the Australian Prime Minister, Tony Abbott, that that's what they believed. Abbott revealed that in an interview he did in 2017 with an Australian journalist. He didn't say at the time what exactly the Malaysians had told him. But recently, I was in a conversation with a well-known Australian journalist who told me that he recently, in the last few weeks, had had a drink with Tony Abbott. The former prime minister told this journalist that the reason the Malaysians had been so convinced was that the only way to control a plane is from the cockpit. The captain and the co-pilot had been locked in the cockpit, and so therefore they were the only possible culprits. For all these years, the Australians have been completely convinced that pretty much certainly the plane must have been taken by Zahari for that simple reason. I mean, there's a lot of other data and evidence and everything that all you can sift through and add it up. But basically, the bottom line is that the captain is in the cockpit. He's locked in the cockpit. The cockpit is the only place you can control a plane from. Therefore, he must be the perpetrator. Well, that's true of most planes. Most planes can only be controlled from the cockpit. But as viewers and listeners of this podcast will know, after last season, the 777 is different from a lot of planes. In the 777, there is another place that you can control the plane from. And this is the electronics bay, which is underneath the passenger cabin and the cockpit, and which can be accessed from the passenger cabin through an unlocked hatch. If you go in there and you know what you're doing, you can have root level access to those computers and you can control everything. So once again, we find ourselves confronting the fact that in MH370 world, a lot of profound decisions are made on partial understanding of the evidence, partial understanding of reality. So there is another way to control, another place that you can control the plane from. And if you're in that plane, you can also control of the satellite communication system that created the data that made search officials think that the plane had gone south. You could tamper with that data, actually take the plane north to Kazakhstan. That endpoint strongly implies that the perpetrators would be agents of Russia. And so you have this whole other alternative set of possibilities to the mainstream official assumption that the pilot had committed mass murder-suicide. And this is that attackers outside of the cockpit could have taken control through the electronics bay and taken the plane to Russia, which leads to the inevitable question, were there any Russians on the plane? And it turns out that yes, there was a Russian on the plane, and he was sitting 12 feet from this unlocked hatch. Today, we're going to find out who that man was. Hi, my name is Jeff Wise. I'm a science journalist and aviation writer. I've been a pilot for 22 years, and I have flown in the course of those years a wide variety of very interesting aircraft. I'm the author of The Taking of MH370. You might know me from the Netflix documentary MH370, The Plane That Disappeared. In today's episode, we're going to talk about Nikolai Brodsky. He was the 7th passenger listed on the official flight manifest that the Malaysian authorities released on Sunday, March 9th, 2014. We're going to see what we can find out about him and what was his reason for being on the plane. Later in the show, we're going to introduce a new segment called Community Radar. This is an idea to basically reach out and bring in the questions, comments, the concerns, the ideas, the memes, whatever is on the minds of readers and listeners, and try to address it in an ongoing way. Before we get to all that, let me just say that obligatory stuff about how if you like what this podcast is doing, if you get a kick out of it, please, it helps us a lot if you can like and subscribe. We also have a show page at deepdivemh370.com. You can ask questions and leave comments there, or you can leave them right here on this YouTube page. Let us know what you're thinking. Let us know any suggestions that you have. If you can, tell your friends about us. It all helps move towards our goal of helping the world understand what happened to this plane, so that we can prevent it from happening again. Okay, let's get into it. Who was Nikolai Brodsky? When I started searching on the internet, just taking those preliminary first steps, Googling, seeing what was out there on the web, I found a fair bit about him. There was a Russian TV station had done an interview with his wife. There were some stories in Russian language news outlets. This was a guy who was fairly prominent in his community. He was a 43-year-old businessman from the city of Irkutsk, which is in the middle, the rather large middle of Russia, near the Lake Baikal, which is, of course, as all geography students know, the largest freshwater lake in the world. Very clear. You can see these lots of videos on YouTube. If you search for Lake Baikal, you'll find lots of movies of people walking on the frozen surface, and it's just so pure and clear that it kind of seems like you're floating on air. It's a little scary, actually. It seems like you could fall through the ice, but kind of magical, actually. Brodsky was sitting in business class seat 3K. Now, in this configuration of this Malaysian Airlines 777, they didn't have a first class per se. It was configured as business class. And so he was in the third row, kind of on the right-hand side. And he was about 12 feet, I calculate, from the hatch of the electronics bay. And again, this is unlocked. It's covered by a piece of carpet. It's near the lavatory. If you just flip up this carpet, lift a handle, boom, you're down in there. It took me a little while. Some information had to come forward. Some information had to be traded by people who understood what some of this technical data meant. But by July, I had started to have strong inklings that there might be an alternative narrative to the idea, which even then had become prevalent, I would say, among serious MH370 observers, namely the pilot murder-suicide idea. I had started to figure out that there was an alternative explanation for how these signals were generated, and that if this alternative explanation was true, it pointed to Russia, and there was a Russian, Nikolai Brodsky, and 2 Ukrainians who were sitting further back. So I did as much research as I could. I found out as much as I could about Nikolai Brodsky, and I hired, through my web of journalistic connections, I knew somebody who knew somebody, and I wound up hiring a very capable researcher in Irkutsk, who I'll just call Masha. That is her real name, but it's a very common Russian name, so I don't think it's going to narrow things down too much. It is extremely dangerous to be in Russia now. I think it became more dangerous even in the first few months after MH370. The world got a much hotter place, especially for aviation. Frankly, after MH17 got shot down, I said to myself, what am I doing? Is it safe? The first thing I did after I heard MH17 was shot down, I reached out to Masha. I said, are you okay? Are you safe? And it didn't occur to her that she might not be safe, but so she was fine. So I had her continue to work for me. But I was nervous on her behalf. She was asking questions that might, if my ideas were right, might, cause the officials in Russia to look askance at what she was doing. But anyway, she felt like it was okay, and I didn't. She was working for me into the fall of 2014. Anyway, she was able to reach out to his friends and relatives. She wound up interviewing one of his relatives one of his friends and three of his relatives. And from what they told her, she was able to assemble a surprisingly detailed picture of his life, in my estimation, especially compared to some of the other people that you'll hear about in future episodes where it wasn't so easy. So Nikolai Brodsky was born in 1971. He was born in Irkutsk. And when he was 8, his family moved to Yakutia, which I think is a territory in risk. And it's basically sort of, when you think of Siberia, when you think about the great expanse of like tundra and taiga and, you know, miles after and miles, this is what it's kind of in the north. It's like kind of rugged. It's sort of like the Alaska of Russia. So when he was 16, he moved back to Irkutsk. He went to a local polytechnic. He, by all accounts, was not a very good student. He didn't seem to be highly motivated. As I think happened a lot in the Soviet times, he got married very young. He got his girlfriend pregnant. So he married his girlfriend, Nadia. They moved to Yakutia again with Brodsky's parents. The marriage was not successful. They had a son. Nadia moved back to Irkutsk. Nikolai Brodsky moved back also, but their marriage ended soon after that. So from the age of 19 to 29, Brodsky basically disappeared from Nadia's life. He moved to a town that was further north. He wound up getting involved in a timber products company. Obviously, timber, logging, wood, these are all major businesses, sort of natural resource extraction. Got involved with a timber products company, turning trees into, things that you can sell. For a while, he tried to continue his education. He was engaged in correspondence courses, but he wasn't a good student, or he didn't have good discipline, and he was expelled for poor performance. But somehow along the way, part of this process of living in the North and being involved in timber, he connected with a future oligarch, one of these wealthy people who became so crucial and core to the Russian economy and political system and corruption, frankly. This guy's name is Vitaly Mashchitsky. And thanks to this connection with this guy who became a real mover and shaker, like one of the richest people in Russia, powerful, Brodsky's fortunes improved dramatically. And so he founded his own wood products company while he was still in his 20s. And ultimately, this business expanded until it had outlets in 3 cities in Siberia and the Russian Far East. This company it seemed to have been specialized in sort of laminated construction materials that were kind of futuristic. And this is kind of a trend these days of like using wood that can replace steel beams and so forth. It's a very high value. Brodsky did very well. He became basically a wealthy guy, which is why we find him traveling in business class from Kuala Lumpur to Beijing in 2014. What did he do with his wealth? Well, Brodsky's particular passion was scuba diving, and not just any scuba diving. Brodsky was adept at a particular kind called trimix gas diving. And this was developed by the military and by industry. It's a way that you can dive very deep, like up to 1,000 feet. And I dive recreationally. I learned to dive in the tropics, and you swim around on coral reefs and the like, and you generally stay within 100 feet of the surface. Below that, it gets a lot harder, more difficult, more technically challenging, more dangerous, and there's less to see. The deeper you go, it gets darker and darker. When you're 1,000 feet down, it's essentially pitch black, perennial night. And so the things that live in the light, corals and fishes and things like this, for the most part, they don't get down that far. So there's a reason why very few people recreationally, who are recreational divers, do this kind of thing. But Brodsky was cut from a different cloth, frankly. He seems to have really been an adventure-loving guy, a guy who liked challenges. He belonged to a local Irkutsk diving club. He was an instructor there. He was listed on their website. They seemed to be a pretty hardy bunch of folk. They had a yearly tradition where at Russian Christmas, which is in January, they would cut a hole in the ice, and they would put a Christmas tree under the ice, and they would jump in and they would all swim around under the ice and like have a party and exchange presents and shoot video of themselves like partying around the underwater Christmas tree. So it seems pretty hardcore. Sub-zero, sub-zero temperatures, and there they are, swimming around in the water, wearing, I presume, fairly thick wetsuits or dry suits, probably. So he was active in this club. He was an instructor in the club. And at the time of his disappearance, he was heading home from an 11-day club dive trip to Bali. And so that's why he was in Kuala Lumpur. He was going to connect in Beijing back to Irkutsk so that he could come home early from this 11-day trip. So at the time my researcher reached out to him, his son, who at the time was 25, his name was Liev, he described his father as, here I quote, a very strong and prepared person, both morally and physically. I've never known him to be afraid of anything. Now, according to Lev, Nikolai Brodsky had never been in the military. All men of his age were required to serve in the, conscript, to serve, to be drafted, basically. Nikolai was not, because apparently he had flat feet. So kind of like Donald Trump, he just didn't have the feet to serve. And I asked some people in Russia, and they said that was pretty common. Nobody really wanted to be a conscript. And if you had some connections, you had some money, you could grease some palms, and all of a sudden your feet are too flat to be in the military. So I mentioned that after his marriage to Nadia broke up, Nikolai had disappeared from her life, from his son's life. So when my researcher interviewed him, he didn't know anything about what his father had been doing between the age of 19 and 29. So we just don't know. There's kind of a gap in the timeline. He was, working with Mashchitsky. Excuse me. My researcher also was able to talk to one of Brodsky's friends. This was a guy who was in the dive club with him. And they also describe Brodsky in similar ways as being very fearless, very competent, always ready to handle any challenge. And there was a very interesting thing. So when Brodsky first joined the club, most of the members were ex-military, because during Soviet times, there was very little disposable income. There was very little kind of upper middle class. People didn't have the money to engage in recreational diving. So the people who knew how to dive had learned in the military. Or maybe there were some people who had learned working for an oil company or something. But there were very few people who had just taken it up on their own. And this was apparently Brodsky's case, where he came to the club, said, "Hey, I want to dive." And so the first day that Brodsky showed up, he went out with 2 instructors and another new member. Conditions were not good. Apparently, I don't know why they were not good. Maybe visibility was bad. Maybe there was wind and surge. Who knows? But conditions were not that good. And yet Brodsky kept his cool while the other newcomer panicked. And so here's a quote from the friend who witnessed this. He said, quote, "Nick felt very comfortable and did not look like a novice diver." And later he got to know Brodsky, said of him, he has a very good mentality, resistance to stress. In any situation, he's collected, makes a sober assessment of what is happening, and never takes risks in vain. Brodsky was adept at rigging whatever needed to be rigged. If there was some mechanical issue that needed to be sorted out, or I don't know, a trailer had to be hitched to something else, or what have you. This is what, here's a quote from the friend. He said, "We often joked about him that he is a hamster. In his car, there were always all sorts of necessary and useful things." So, and Brodsky really seemed to enjoy the challenge of diving in difficult conditions that might kind of spoil the fun for less hardy folk. He didn't actually like diving, the kind of diving that I and most recreational divers do. He didn't like the warm water kind of conditions like you would find in Bali. So when the club would organize various trips, Nikolai would usually skip those trips. So here's another quote from the friend. He took part almost in all dive club activities except for long trips. His decision to go to Bali with the club was pretty unexpected. He didn't love the warm water and this kind of activity. So this, because the trip was a kind of one of these group trips, package trips, where you get to go and the local guides will take you to the the sightseeing attractions that all the other visiting divers go to. It just wasn't the kind of deep, dark, challenging, under the ice kind of thing that Nikolai Brodsky found interesting. So he cuts the trip short. Why did he even go? This was a long and expensive trip. Why did he bail out, 3 days before the end of it? Maybe he just didn't like that kind of trip, which makes you wonder, why did he go in the first place if he didn't like it? But the official explanation, or at least the explanation that filtered out through local media, was that March 8th was International Women's Day, which is a big holiday in the former Soviet Union. And Nikolai had promised his wife, his new wife, that he would be back home to have dinner with her. When I first heard it, I thought that sounds pretty far fetched. I'd never even heard of International Women's Day, but I have been since assured that this actually is kind of a thing. It's a bit like Valentine's Day without less of a romantic emphasis. So, yeah, that was the explanation. Then through Masha, another explanation was given, which is that he had a pre-planned business trip to Mongolia. That's pretty much all the information I was able to get on Nikolai Brodsky. There was more I wanted to ask. I was really, I would have been intrigued to know if Brodsky played a role in planning this trip, because it did. If he was a Russian agent, this trip was an alibi. It was an excuse to be on this plane. Wasn't a perfect excuse, um, because it did seem odd that he left so early. But I thought if he played a role, if he said to the club, "Hey, if it was his idea for the club to go to Bali," that might, be suspicious. If maybe he kind of thought this will be my explanation for why I'm on the plane. But I never got answers to that, because Masha wasn't. There was only so far she was able to get with her inquiries. So I was left wondering. I was left wondering about the 10 years that he had disappeared from his son's life. So we don't know what he was doing. Was he getting training? Maybe he was in the military, but his son just didn't know about it. Um, and I was also intrigued by his personality type. I mean, he sounded. I keep the word that keeps coming to my head is MacGyver. He seems like a guy who, when the chips are down, he'll wire together some chewing gum and some baling wire, and he'll solve the problem under pressure. And also the fact that he was a diver, as people might remember from last season, it has been speculated that a way to remove passengers from the equation would be to depressurize the cabin. And if you were doing that, and you were an expert in breathing trimix gases, or you're an expert in working working in a mask um, under pressure, both physically and psychologically, that would seem to be a really crucial skill set. But that's just speculation. Ultimately, I wasn't able to pin down anything definitive about Brodsky. It's a challenge. I was trying to do this from thousands of miles away, at a time when the Russian regime was becoming increasingly dangerous and hostile. I don't think we can rule him in or out as a possible perpetrator. If he had been frail, incapacitated, or if he had been 5 years old, I think that would have ruled it out. Um, It's ambiguous, frankly. Like a lot of evidence in MH370, it's a puzzle piece that can fit in different ways depending on what story you're trying to tell. Well, that's all I have for you about Nikolai Brodsky. But I do have something that's pretty exciting, a whole new segment that we're trying for the first time. So drum roll, please. Okay, well, this is an exciting new segment that we have never done before, and it's called Community Radar. And the idea is that our intrepid social media director, Emily, has been out scouring the countryside of reader input and is going to feed us back to us, tell us what's out there on the horizon. So I'd like to welcome Emily Morgul, who
Hi.
I've mentioned before, but we've never seen on screen before. So this is kind of new. Emily, you hail from Houston, Texas,
Uh,
United States.
Houstonian, yes.
And what else? What else? You have some very interesting things about yourself. I was hoping you could share some of these things.
So I have a background in political science.
Mm-hmm.
I also have a background in investigative journalism. I am a professional makeup artist, and I am a women's rights advocate as well.
And what about you're running for Congress? Is that right?
I haven't officially announced it yet, but
Okay.
yes, 2026. Watch out,
Okay.
John Cornyn.
Okay. Great. Well, that I think that might be it then. I think that might be the official announcement. This is the first ever announcement of a political office candidate here. You heard it here. I hope you win,
Thank you.
and I hope
Me too.
you pass some good laws in Congress and help make our country the fine democracy it deserves to be. Emily, let's get right to it. What have you found? What are people talking about? So the idea is that this is community radar,
Mhm.
and I want you to tell us what is happening. What is the buzz?
Okay, so actually, we had a Twitter comment from Grace at 2GC4 underscore, and
Mm-hmm.
she specifically wants to know your opinion on
Mm-hmm.
the alleged photos of MH370 being found in the deep jungles of Cambodia. And she specifically wants to know your opinion because she thinks
Yeah.
you are the best expert to answer the question.
Oh, well, that's nice. Well, so I saw this tweet, and she included a link
Mhm.
to a website that I had not was not familiar to me. I think it was like an Indian news
Mhm.
site, and so kind of a little red flag right there. If you don't recognize the site, or it's not a reputable or known publication, that might be. I might have to ask a few extra questions.
Mhm.
But this was about a guy who I guess this was a claim that had been made several years back, and for some reason another outlet had picked it up. And this guy was claiming that he was looking around at Google Earth images, and he
Mhm.
saw a plane in the jungle in Cambodia, and he's like, "Well, if it's a missing plane, it must be MH370, right?"
Duh.
So what did you make of it, Emily?
So I did my own research, and I
Okay.
will say all of the websites that I found were either foreign websites or
Mm,
ragmag websites here in the United States. I could not find any credentials for him
mm,
whatsoever, even though it says that he's a tech expert.
right.
And according to the Cambodian government, that photo is actually approximately 8 years old. And it just recently surfaced again last year.
Okay. So it kind of raises a bunch of red flags.
Mm-hmm.
Questions like, why is this being reported now if it happened
Mm-hmm.
8 years ago? Um, I mean, from a technical perspective, anytime someone hits me up with a sighting that's not near the seventh arc,
Mm-hmm.
you're sort of presupposing that all of the Inmarsat data is just wrong
Mm-hmm.
for kind of unknown reasons, and that, to my mind, really puts it in a lower probability
Mm-hmm.
quadrant. Uh, So I have to say, I'm not giving this one a lot of credence. And was there also reference to the idea that somebody was saying that this image was from like 2004 or something. It was like actually predated MH370.
What I saw in my research said that it came out approximately 8 years ago.
8 years from 2024.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. All right. Well, so thank you to
Mhm.
our listener, viewer, reader who sent that in. I think we're going to have to say that it doesn't seem like to be much of a breakthrough. We do get a lot of sightings like this. There's a lot of people making claims. Um, I've talked in the past season about the woman. One of the main questions I got after
Mhm.
the show came out on Netflix was, what about the woman who saw the plane on Tomnod, the
Yeah.
satellite um, website that was kind of inviting people to look at imagery? And my reaction was, I don't think that she had anything at all. It's easy to see patterns in clouds and wave tops and so forth. Again, what she claimed to have seen a shape that looked like a plane in the water in the South China Sea, which
Mhm.
again is not near the seventh arc, and so it would be very problematic if that were MH370. So again, there's a lot of people kind of chiming in and saying, "Hey, I think I found it," but what they found doesn't really look very much, like a missing 777, and it also doesn't really match where we would expect to find it.
Yeah. Now, I have a question about the direction in which he thought that the plane was going. Do you think
Okay.
he is subscribed to Florence's theory that it was shot down over the South China Sea? Do you think that maybe that's his way of thinking?
Well, I mean, it is true that when the plane first went missing, like in the early hours after it disappeared, there was some misunderstanding within Malaysian Airlines that they thought it was in Malaysia. Well, they thought it was, I'm sorry, in Cambodian airspace.
Mm-hmm.
That was just a misunderstanding. So Cambodia is a destination that had, from the very early days was considered to be amongst the possibilities. And again, as you point out, Florence de Changy also, her whole theory is that the plane was shot down over the South China Sea. Unfortunately, there is no evidence for her claim. I think it's really, to call it a theory is even maybe overstating it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so, but because it has gotten so much attention, her book has gotten a lot of sales and a lot of promotion, and she was on the Netflix documentary that I was in. It's gotten a lot of credence. It's gotten a lot of eyeballs, and so this is sort of one of the many problems we have in trying to seriously look at the evidence in this case, is that there's so many layers of misinformation and misunderstanding
Mm-hmm.
that already exist that we're kind of like trying to shovel our way out of.
Yeah, and I think that people have two motives for bringing up the fact that they may have found MH370. I
Yeah,
think that A, people want to be the one who found the missing plane, the one that nobody could find. And
yeah,
two, I think people want to be the one who can give the families the good
yeah.
news that they can finally bury their loved ones.
Hey, I can relate to that. I want to solve this mystery too. I think we all want to solve the mystery for those
Yeah.
reasons. So we have that motivation. I don't want to cast aspersions on the motivations of people, and
Yeah.
I don't think that they're bad people. I just don't think that what they found is actually it. Anyway, Emily, thank you for your debut on this podcast, and thank you for all the help you've been providing behind the scenes. We will catch you later.
See you later.
Okay, well, that's all I have for you today. This has been Deep Dive MH370 Season 2, Episode 2. As ever, our goal is to try to drop a new episode every Friday. For full show notes, please visit us at deepdivemh370.com. You can leave your comments, questions, suggestions here or at the show page. And again, if you can like, subscribe, tell your friends about us, anything you can do to help us out, we greatly appreciate it. The more people know about this, the more we can try to help people understand what might have happened to this plane so that we can prevent it from happening again. So until next week, Don't stop looking and don't stop asking hard questions. So long.